Hello, my name is Alex Ovcharik and I'm Dean of Science at the University of Melbourne. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this special and very topical event for National Science Week, Trust and Knowledge, the Role of Universities in a Crisis. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, which is currently, like I am sure it is for many of you, the same place. This is the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I extend my respects to the traditional custodians of all the lands upon which we are gathered, and to any Indigenous people joining us tonight. What an extraordinary year we are in. It began with one of the greatest crises to face our nation in decades, the summer bushfires, that devastated so much of this beautiful country and gave rise to loud and persuasive calls for more action on climate change. But we hadn't even begun to clean up when COVID-19 came upon us with great fury. And in the midst of this, the Black Lives Matter movement became a global force, highlighting the crisis of racism and inequality spanning generations and saying loudly, "Enough already." Of course, that list is far from a complete of crises, even for this year. But through it all, universities are there, gathering and sharing knowledge, training the next generation of leaders, solving problems. And it is times like this when it is worth stepping back and asking, what is our role? Where do we fit in? Where should we fit in? And that is why I'm so pleased to introduce this event and this great mix of panelists, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussions to come. Now, I'll ask them all now to join me on screen. I begin by welcoming Associate Professor Michael-Shawn Fletcher. Michael is a geographer interested in long-term interactions between humans, climate, disturbance, vegetation and landscapes, with a particular emphasis on Indigenous burning. Earlier this year, I appointed Michael as the Assistant Dean Indigenous in the Faculty of Science, and all I can say is that what an excellent decision that turned out to be. Next, I am very pleased to welcome the Vice-Chancellor of Queensland University of Technology, Professor Margaret Sheil. She is also an acclaimed chemist, and in 2017, she was made an Officer of the Order of Australia for her distinguished service to science and higher education as an academic and administrator, and she's well known to those of us at the University of Melbourne. Now, it's not often that I get to introduce not one, but two Vice-Chancellors in a row. But today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Duncan Maskel, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne. Duncan is a microbiologist whose expertise is in infectious bacterial diseases, and I suspect he might know also a thing or two about viruses. Prior to becoming my boss, Duncan spent time at the University of Oxford, Imperial College London, and the University of Cambridge. And finally, our moderator, Dr. Jen Martin. Jen trained as an ecologist and turned out to be such a good communicator of science that she made a career of it. Jen is the founder and head of our science communication teaching program here in the faculty, and it is a passionate and very popular teacher. Those in Melbourne might know Jen's voice from her regular appearances in the 3RRR radio. Now, welcome Jen, and now I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you to everybody who is joining us. So, unprecedented, new normal, challenging times. These are just some of the words and phrases that are getting a lot of airtime at the moment. I mean, who ever thought that we'd hear the word pivot used in so many sentences? And I didn't kind of imagine that so many of us would find comfort in presses, beginning with the phrase, "Is everyone right to go?" And I think crisis is another one of these key words that we are all focused on at the moment. So I'm going to jump straight in. Margaret, thank you for joining us. Now, it seems to me that COVID-19 has really thrown down the gauntlet to science and to universities to show that we can make a difference to the world in a time of crisis. So I'm interested to know, are you encouraged by what you've seen so far this year?
Jen, I am, and I think there's unlike other scientific issues, and climate change would be an example, there's a growing respect and recognition of expertise in the current crisis that we haven't had, I think, in other, I mean, the climate change debate is a good contrast. And I think the fact that we've able to, we've had so many good scientists explaining what's going on to the general public in a way that increasingly, as you see the same faces or a set of faces on the screen each week, how good they're getting at communicating very difficult concepts to the general public. So that's one thing, the communication, which is your business. But more than that, it's, the way that those working on vaccines have got together. In our case, our air quality experts collaborating around the world to put pressure on the World Health Organization around airborne transmission. There's just been and again, each of those is underpinned by very strong science, but also good collaboration and a set of skills that I think many of the general public and the media may not have realised the depth of that in Australia.
Absolutely. Encouraged, Michael, Duncan, is that a word that fits how you're feeling at the moment?
Yes, and I think it's really shown the role that science can play in society. And, I really think that people are listening, especially the medical officers that get up with the various state and government leaders time and time again and give us their talk. And I think the Victorian medical health officer is almost a little bit of a superstar now, isn't he? Because people trust him and trust the message that he gives. I think there's a really nice dichotomy there, as Margaret alluded to the other crisis that we do face at the moment, which is climate change, and the inherent distrust that people have in science, or at least it's been seeded in there by various means. So I think hopefully it's going a long way to re-establishing trust of people in science. And I think that hopefully going forward, that's one of the enduring things that comes from this, beyond getting a vaccine and us getting lives back onto some kind of normality or normal road. Hopefully for me that it engenders a more trusting relationship between science and the public.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting situation actually, because it's not actually, in point of fact, the pandemic that's causing the trouble in the economy and society. It's the way that we have chosen to respond to the pandemic that is causing it. And I think in the modern age, we've come to a point where we think we can have serious agency over these natural disasters. If this happened 100 years ago, there was very little we could do to control it. And, let's be serious here. I'm an infectious disease person. Pandemics have occurred throughout human history. Pandemics occur in other animals too, incidentally. So infectious diseases are part of the landscape. People die from infectious diseases all of the time around the world. It's just that this particular infectious disease is a new one. And when it first came along, we didn't know what it might do to us. We didn't know if it could be like the original SARS virus, which had a 10% case fatality rate, or if it was going to be more like influenza with a sort of 0.1, 0.2% case fatality rate. It happens to be, at the moment, WHO estimate around a 0.65 case fatality rate. And that is interestingly demographically spread as well. It's usually elderly people who are at highest risk of dying, but that's true of a lot of respiratory viruses, incidentally. And young people were very almost very tiny probability of dying. So the way that society has responded to this particular pandemic as a connected global society, I think is the key issue. Now that response has been informed by science, and I think there's a fascinating interface actually between scientific advice and how politicians and public servants respond to that advice and implement it. And that I actually think, it might be controversial to say this, but I actually think we're already at a point where the pure science advice needs to be, also understood through a number of other lenses about how society is going to function. You know, at what point do the measures that we take to suppress the infectious disease rate actually start to do more damage than the disease itself? You know, I'm very concerned actually that if we carry on in this kind of lockdown mindset for too long, we will seriously damage young people's lives. And we already know that there are some deaths that are, you know, some death rates are increased. I mean, there's more suicide going on at the moment. If we have an economy that's not functioning, we'll have serious poverty problems, which we all know, lots of studies show will lead to increased morbidity and mortality in society. So, you know, that's a really difficult problem. And I really wouldn't want to be a politician grappling with that, frankly. But the point I'm really trying to make is that the scientific advice has been great. There needs to be now some social science advice, or whatever we're going to call it, coming in to help to understand how we move on from this situation. One other thing I'd say, though, is that the sort of hard science in the background, bringing together different disciplines to address this problem, has been tremendous. And you know, I think you know, the general public, if you want to call people that, are beginning to realise how complicated these things are and how many people can come into play here. One of the things I'm really worried about, just as a final point in this though, is scientific nationalism. You know, there's the Australian vaccine, there's the UK vaccine, there's even the Oxford vaccine and the Cambridge vaccine, for Christ's sake. This is crazy. This is a world crisis. We need to pool all our resources, and we need to work across, you know, crazy national boundaries to derive answers that are going to work for the whole world, in my opinion.
You guys have done a superb job of touching on a whole lot of things that we want to come to during this discussion. So that was a wonderful beginning in response to our first question. So I think while we're working to solve the COVID-19 crisis, universities have also obviously had to deal with a huge impact that it's having on our abilities to function, in some cases their continued existence. So for me, as a teaching academic, I've loved the challenges and all the opportunities that have come with teaching fully online, but it's also been a huge amount of work. So Michael, you're a teacher, you're a researcher. Can you tell us, how has this pandemic affected you? How have you adapted? Give us a bit of an insight into what's been going on for you for the last, what are we up to now? 5 months, I think, 6 months?
It feels like an eternity, Jen.
I know.
Yeah, it's been pretty challenging, I would say, especially, and I imagine a lot of it's to do with personality. I'm very much an interactive face-to-face person, and a lot of my teaching is on country, in place, which is almost impossible now. I'm a very tactile sort of person. So it's been a lot of front-end work and a lot of challenges to try and deliver my content online. There's all sorts of things that have increased the workload. The other benefit, I think, at least through lockdown 1 for me, is I felt a real sense of community togetherness. You know, I'd go outside, walk the kids around the block, and people be saying hello, socially distanced, of course, and it sort of buoyed me through that. It sort of gave me a bit of, energy to achieve those tasks and knuckle down and do that. This next one, latest one, seems really a bit more severe, you know, and it's actually, as Duncan really correctly alludes to, mental health, all these sorts of things are really an ever-present or really present danger through this set of restrictions. For me, once you get me talking, I'm pretty good, but I think converting your content to be online, allowing those assessments that we normally do in a different way to work. Some of my work, if it's not on country, out in the field, it's in the lab, which has been very difficult to organise and maintain. So it's added a serious layer of pressure. On top of that, I work a lot in the bushfire space and the cultural burning and Indigenous burning space. And there's been a lot of demand in that area as well. So it feels like for those of us in the space, I imagine medical professionals would be really feeling this now, trying to deliver your normal job, along with the added extra load that's come along with demands about trying to understand and mitigate these crises. It seems like a really enormous workload.
And add some remote learning on top, perhaps, for some of us.
Yeah.
Margaret and Duncan, I might just ask a similar question to both of you. I'm pretty confident in thinking that something that's been keeping both of you awake at night is how do we balance this really strong need for us to contribute to solving the crisis, and by we I'm talking about universities, with also the need to survive the crisis? I mean, you're Vice Chancellors. How can you talk to me about how you've been balancing this? I think it's all yours, Duncan. It's been handballed to you.
What was the question again?
I'm interested in how you balance the need that you want our universities to be contributing to solving the crisis with also the need to survive the crisis. You know, that's a balancing act.
Well, of course we have to survive the crisis. I mean, my absolutely overwhelmingly primary objective is to work out, or to make sure that this university survives the crisis. We've been here for 167 years or something. You know, we need to be here. We're a perpetual institution. We need to continue on forever. We need to think about the future generations. We need to think about setting up the university in a way that's fit for purpose for future generations. So that's an incredibly important objective for me. But I don't think that in any way precludes continuing as much as we can with our daily work. I've been incredibly impressed with people like Michael and all the others who've gone across to doing the online learning thing so wonderfully and efficiently. It's just incredible to see what's happened there. Similarly, you know, it's really, as a scientist, it must be terribly heart-wrenching to not be able to get into the lab and do your research if your research isn't considered to be, you know, crucial, as it were. But within the University of Melbourne, certainly, we still have quite a lot of people working in the labs on essential research. So, you know, many people are still working in the Doherty Institute, obviously, because if they didn't, we wouldn't be having the research going on that's required to beat this problem. So, you know, I don't think those two things are in, you know, survival versus contribution to the solution. I don't think those two things are in, they're not fighting with each other, actually. They're just two things we've got to do at the same time.
I'll just add to that in terms of back to the delivering of online content, and even having meetings like this and events like this. What it did for me, it kind of lifted the lid on what's possible with this medium. And it's something I think that will have a lot of really important effects down the line, maybe less travel, less consumption of resources in conducting our duties, all of this sort of stuff, maybe more flexible working arrangements, better lifestyles. So there's going to be a lot of benefits that come out of this forced move into something that a lot of us were probably really reticent to get into.
But I'm really, really missing people, Michael, like you are.
Yeah, yeah. I'm with you.
Missing the buzz of being on campus with all those young people around, you know, excited about launching out on a new phase of their lives and all those kinds of things. I think that's so important. I'm really missing it.
Yep.
I'm nodding in agreement with both of you. I'm a raging extrovert who's desperately missing people, but it's also been quite miraculous, some of the advantages we've found to teaching online. Who would have guessed? Yeah. Margaret,
so Jen,
your perspective?
Well, mine's slightly different because, you know, we're you know, you can see I'm in my office, basically have been through the whole period, and we didn't ever shut down. Most of our academics worked on from home and online as they put their material online, but we always had a small presence on campus, and that's growing. So, you know, we're back on campus in second semester, but with most lectures being online. So I'm being an extrovert as well. I don't think I would have done too well if I had to stay home, and besides I have no broadband essentially in my house. So, you know, I'm in backward parts of the world. But what it's really done is enabled us to focus on what is better online and what's not. And I think we're going to have a much more sophisticated conversation about the role of online material and you know, what is possible, and, you know, the way in which we've done exams and various other things. And, you know, the biggest spin-off is climate change, because we've just stopped getting on planes and travelling to Canberra or Melbourne for 1-hour meetings. So, and I don't think we'll ever go back to that. You know, I think it's, you know, we've discovered a way to interact. So that's really positive. And so that's a good thing. I think in terms of responding and contributing at the same time, the thing that we were able to do because of our particular circumstances of my leadership team and various other people pretty early on, I thought if we're all going to be doing everything here, we're going to fall over. So I divided and I had a brand new provost arrive, so he was able to focus on the future because he didn't really know anything about the ongoing business because he just walked in the door. So I had the acting provost doing other things. I've had people, so working out that in order to ensure that we functioned as a team and also kept ourselves going, the overload of the responding to what was on the news every night and what was UQ doing or what was, other universities doing. We partitioned who was leading what pretty early on. And I think that was a good call because it meant that I had people working on the immediate crisis and the future at the same time, but not the same people. And so I think that was just a good lesson for me on how to manage through this. And also, I think universities my DVC International mentioned this strange virus in Wuhan in either the first or the second week in January. So we started responding earlier than almost any other sector. And so by the time the rest of the community started to react to this, we were 4 or 5 weeks in, or maybe even longer. And I do remember, Duncan, you may not recall this, but on a very early teleconference at the Universities of Australia, you said the challenge is people misinterpreting community risk measures for increasing their individual risk. And I just use that line all the time in almost every response. It was a very helpful piece of collaboration. And that has been the challenge. The more we ramped up the community measures, the more people got anxious about their individual health situation. And so that's another really good learning that we've got to, it's again about contributing, but also learning how to respond in an intelligent way.
Absolutely. So I want to move on to thinking a little bit about trust. And we've touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to explore it a bit more. So next week, I'm giving a lecture comparing the role of expert voices in the public and the political responses to climate change, the Australian bushfires and COVID-19. And I'm planning on sharing a quote with the students from Julia Gillard from just a couple of weeks ago where she was speaking for the Australia Institute. And Julia Gillard said, we've been in an era in climate discussion with climate change skepticism, but not just in climate. There's been a reaction against expertise. Why do we have to listen to them? They have all these qualifications, but isn't it just common sense? Yet here we are, hanging off every word from our chief medical officers and infectious disease specialists. And it shows expertise matters. And Michael, as you said before, I mean, Brett Sutton's become a cult figure. Has everyone gone out and bought their, their cushions and their mugs with Brett Sutton's face there? I'm really interested, Duncan, you mentioned earlier you think this is the case, but I'd really like to hear from all of you. Might this global pandemic signal a true shift in how experts are trusted, both by the public and by our governments?
My answer to that is no.
Damn, I was hoping you'd say yes.
Look, I think my first real memory of where my naive juvenile mindset in my 20s was challenged was back in England in the 1980s. There was an inquiry about something reasonably scientific that was produced, and a report was made. And the then Thatcher government, Mrs. Thatcher, came out and said, well, we're rejecting the report. And she rejected the report because the report's conclusion did not coincide with her own ideological and political viewpoint. Right? So that for me was the first moment of threat to my naive belief that science and the truth and everything should be the thing that dictates how people behave and what we do about these kinds of things. So I think that we've moved over those, since then actually, over the last, three or four decades, to a place where now many people are challenged by even understanding what truth is and what facts are. It's almost like the postmodern nightmare has come true. It's all about the narrative and not about the facts. And that's only enhanced, I think, with, and I must say there's a lot of great journalists, but there are quite a few sloppy journalists too, who are just out for the sensational story. It's enhanced by the notion of balance in the media. So I remember back in the UK when the MMR vaccine controversy was going on, there were the entire establishment, again, a bad word that's used badly by people at the moment, of infectious diseases experts knew that the MMR vaccine was not causing autism, right, which was the controversy at the time. But on every news story on the TV news, they always had an anti-vaxxer to oppose that. So there were 9,999 to 1 was the views, but nevertheless there was a 1-to-1 debate going on. So when you get into that sort of dynamic, it's very, very hard for so-called experts, like me, say, to get on there and to tell a very complicated story. And I think that's the other thing. A lot of the science we're talking about is really complicated, and a lot of it is contingent. Scientists, by their nature, if they're doing their work properly and if they're following a Popperian approach to science, they're trying to disprove their hypothesis. We are trained to go into the lab on a daily basis and try and find out that our ideas are wrong. And if you're in that mindset, then it's really hard to turn around and say, yes, I'm 100% certain that this vaccine is safe, for example. Because you can't be, but you can be as certain as you can be, if you like. So that is where I think a lot of the problem lies. And that is only amplified massively by the last, say, decade and a half since social media came along, where every single person on the planet who has a social media account feels they have the right to not just comment on stuff, but have their comment taken seriously. And so the number of people that you see commenting on complicated issues with simplistic, sound bites, effectively, is really quite frightening. I mean, just even relatively simple scientific concepts are actually quite hard to understand unless you've got a good grounding in the basics. And getting that across in a public setting is really hard. So it's not surprising, I think, that a lot of the public who maybe haven't had a scientific education find it difficult to understand what I'm saying, as an expert in the field, if I'm trying to get across a complex message. So I think that for all of those different reasons, there are cracks in how the scientists can present themselves, which the politicians will get into and use if it suits their purposes. And if it suits the politicians' purposes, it's also going to suit commentators' purposes and all sorts of other people who are either unwittingly or on purpose undermining the credibility of those experts. And just to finish up, in the Brexit debate in the UK, just before I came over to Australia, one of the government ministers, Michael Gove, said, we've had enough of experts. We don't need experts to tell us about this stuff. And I mean, when you have a government minister coming out and saying such nonsense, then that it's really hard for us to recover from that sort of assault, actually.
Yeah, well, I think we've all seen the rise of the armchair epidemiologist this year, haven't we? Margaret, Michael, any more optimism?
No, I'm a bit more optimistic. I don't actually blame social media. I blame the media.
Yeah, right.
and I live in a state where the national newspaper and the local and the daily Brisbane newspaper and the regional TV network is all owned by a single proprietor who has relentlessly targeted climate change scientists and in an effort to discredit them in the whole, in the climate change debate. So I actually think the more democratic the media is, ultimately we'll be better off, because we just do not have the diversity of media in Queensland as an example, but Western Australia I think is similar. So I think there's been quite a very deliberate, and we know, Michael, you would have had it, anybody who's commented publicly on climate change, you get this barrage of feedback, whether it's, on social media or in email or in other ways. And so I think that's been quite deliberate here in Australia in a way maybe that hasn't occurred in other places, and you could look at what the interests of that have generated, that have laid behind that. But it is really interesting that something as abstract as a virus, with a set of risks around a virus, in the way that this has played out, that the general public have accepted that we need to deal with that risk. But something as abstract, they equally can't see climate change except if you understand that bushfires and other effects are related to it, but they don't accept it. And it's and so it's whether after we've come through this, if in the end the science and the public commentary of science has really regenerated some trust in the general public, whether we can also reinstill that in the commentary around climate change.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I agree with all those. I guess I note the things that Duncan has said in the pessimistic view of the relationship. I generally am a bit more of an optimist, or some might even call it naive, that I think we might be able to capture a moment here. You know, like every press conference that the PM and the premiers have gone up with, they've had an expert with them. So if there was the right stock of people or the right sort of will when it came to issues which sort of exceed the remit of the minister and they need to draw on scientific advice, it'd be, if we had the right people in place, and I want to get on to potentially how this might occur, to capture that moment and to build rapport and trust with governments. And I think we have a role to play as universities here in kind of, I don't know what the word is, maybe talent map or understand who in our ranks from students right through to staff are good communicators or want to be leaders, and work on, and we probably do this anyway, I'm just ignorant to it, work at strategic placements, secondments, all these kinds of things, train the people to communicate effectively, speak the language, not going with too much alarmism, understand that, you know, the social fabric around, and some of the responses to climate change might be just a fear of not being able to do anything about it whatsoever. And there's a natural pushback. There's a whole lot of stuff we can do to create the kind of agents in society that can really help in this, build that trust and maintain that trust. And I don't know whether they're out there, I'm sure they are, but now's a moment, everyone's just used to seeing, say, Daniel Andrews, I'm here in Victoria, walk up to his press conference with a scientific expert with him, you know, and then the right person speaking to the right thing. So if we can get that discourse as a kind of permanent feature or build that relationship, then we'll go a long way to remedying some of that situation where the politicians, through self-interest, through big business, through all these sorts of things, are preying on those cracks and divide. But yeah, that might be my, you know, when I move on in my career a bit more, I might become pessimistic as well, but yeah.
Michael, that's the perfect segue to the next thing that I wanted to ask you. You must have read my mind, thank you. But full disclosure, I might be slightly speaking from a biased position here, given that my entire job is to teach scientists how to be better communicators. But I'm just wondering, like, is this largely a question of communication? Are universities and scientists doing enough to be innovators in communication, or do we need to do a whole lot more? Is it really the communication that is at question here?
Well, I'll chime in just for maybe the others. I think Duncan, in his explanation of science being a complex thing, this problem is also complex. It's probably a bit of everything, you know, like all we can do is control what's within our remit. We can train and create those agents, if you like, or those people who can communicate effectively and speak to these things, and, you know, work on the other spaces in the way that we do with our research and public commentary and all of this kind of stuff. But we control what we control, I think, and do what we can.
And
I think,
you go, Duncan.
You go, Margaret. Sorry.
Oh. Well, I was going to say, we've got some really good vehicles that were put in place a number of years ago that I think has meant that we've had better expert advice in this climate, whether it's the Science Media Centre, whether it's pursued at the University of Melbourne, whether it's other forms of, you know, training and communication of science, I mean, and your profession. I think if this crisis had happened 15 years ago, I don't think we would have had the breadth of talent to display that expertise, not talent in terms of the science, but talent in terms of communicating the science. But we can always do more. But I think there's some really good examples of good practice, and those, you know, that I would call out.
Absolutely agree.
The situation now around the world, certainly here, and to a large extent back where I've just come from, the UK, is so much better in terms of scientists communicating their science and wanting to do so publicly. There are always going to be some scientists who are useless at it and don't want to do it and should never try to do it, actually. But that's fine. You know, there'll be others who are naturals. But, you know, the only thing I wanted to say to add to all those important points that have been made by the other two is that I sometimes think that we should move away from expecting everybody to be a jack of all trades. You know, scientists have got so many other things that they have to do these days other than just do their science. And adding on to everybody's plate being a great communicator as well is perhaps a little unrealistic. You know, I'm a great believer in teams. I think that public communicators, journalists and others, you know, they're the professionals. They're the ones who know how to do this stuff really, really well. And so I would love to work out how we can generate really good teams where there are, you know, people like me and Margaret and Michael-Shawn, and we can be embedded with, or have embedded with us, you know, journalists who are keen to give our message out there, rather than sort of trying to pick holes in it, if you see what I mean. And if we could generate that kind of landscape or ecosystem, what do you want to call it, I think that could be really productive, actually.
I do have thousands of wonderful science students who've studied with me who would love to come and do some communication with you, Duncan. So just, you know, let me know anytime. But I think that's a lovely link too. We do really want to think more about multidisciplinary research and the immense benefits of people coming together in teams and bringing their different skills and expertise. So Duncan, you wrote recently about the English novelist and chemist C.P. Snow and his famous 1959 speech about the two cultures problem, with the idea that science and arts just don't understand each other at all. Can you tell us a bit more about what C.P. Snow was on about, and do you think that that problem is still very much alive today?
Well, try to. It was the Reed Lecture in 1959, and it was actually in the Senate House in Cambridge that he gave it. A place I've been many, many times in my previous job. He was talking actually about not just humanities and arts people and science people not understanding each other, but also there being a sort of perverse pride in not understanding each other. And he was a scientist, so he was really having a pop at the humanities people and saying, you know, we're building this great edifice of physics. You know, the non-scientists amongst us take pride in not understanding, essentially. I find that, first of all, I think that it's sad that that was set up as a competition like that. And I think C.P. Snow bringing attention to it was fine, but actually in some respects wasn't fine, because it started that whole, you know, juxtaposition, which is an unfortunate one. Most scientists I know have some kind of artistic thing going on in their lives. I was a musician for a while, you know, in my youth. Most people I've ever had through my lab, you know, have done something or other artistic or creative. And actually doing science is one of the most creative things that people do, frankly, you know. And you've got to have a really creative mindset to understand quantum mechanics, for example. It's just incredible. I think that the two cultures argument became fixed in some people's minds, although pretty soon after he made the first lecture in 59, he published some more stuff only 3 or 4 years later, sort of rowing back from there a little bit. I actually think that it doesn't matter what happened then. I think now we should be we should not be proud of ourselves if we take a position that says, I'm a scientist and I don't think the arts are worth anything. And we should not be proud of ourselves if we're a arts and humanities person and we say, oh, science has got nothing to teach me. I think that the beauty of being alive in this kind of world, and especially in a university like ours, is to be able to dip into all those different areas and learn from each other and learn from those different disciplines. And I think that's so important. And moreover, I think when you bring some really disparate disciplines together, you do get some really exciting and interesting things going on. The anecdote I've got from my career is that as a hardcore molecular scientist studying bacteria, my whole outlook on things was changed when we were working in doing some research in Vietnam, and we teamed up with some social anthropologists. And the social anthropologists taught us how to ask the right questions in that country, in that setting and in that culture, that our hard science could help to address. Whereas before that, we were going into that country almost in a colonial way, expecting that we could just understand how these people were working and we were going to take the samples that we thought were appropriate. You know, and so that juxtaposition there for me really, really changed my scientific thinking in such an important way. I think there's all sorts of things like that come into play. And as I said at the start, you know, at the moment with the COVID-19 situation, we need to get ethicists, we need to get philosophers, we need to get legal minds, we need to get economists, certainly, sociologists, anthropologists, all sorts of different disciplines involved in thinking about how we deal worldwide with this virus that isn't going away anytime soon. You know, and I think that cross-disciplinarity, not just a cross-disciplinarity where a biologist works as a physicist, but a cross-disciplinarity across the sciences and the non-science subjects is so important. So if there is a two cultures divide, let's heal it. Let's build big bridges across it, and let's make sure that we talk to each other and understand each other and get the synergy from that. I think that's so important.
I'm waiting to see if either Michael or Margaret would like to jump in there.
I thought Margaret was, so I'll wait for you, Margaret, if you want to.
What I was going to say is that, Michael, geography is the ultimate in
exactly
between science and the social sciences. So I think Michael's, you know, it epitomises everything that, you know, I'm a big fan of geography, as you know. So I was going to let Michael talk.
Yeah, and I'm constantly living in this space of kind of silo busting and in geography, and we do it really well. And I just wanted to also touch on some of the things that Duncan's talking about. It is very cultural. You know, if we think about the different way that different cultures look at knowledge and understanding, these silos just disappear. You know, there's no arts and science and all of these sorts of things. And we have a real role to play in embracing different cultures and different epistemologies, ways of knowing under our roof. And not shoehorning them into a Western kind of way, allowing them to cross-cut and do whatever it is they do. You know, we've got the Indigenous Knowledge Institute, which will do that kind of work, and all of these sorts of things. That can happen outside of these prescribed institutes to do that. But it really requires meaningful collaboration, bringing people on and training them and building capacity for people to create and disseminate their knowledge and work at these problems. And then you'll find, I mean, a lot of the problems we're dealing now, we're talking about with COVID, it's a medical problem that's going to have all kinds of social and economic ripples to it. You know, these aren't singular entities. And sure, we have a very Western construct geography that does this really well, health geography, all of these kinds of things. The work that I do uses science and embeds that in Indigenous knowledge, all of these kind of things. It's cross-cutting. I think we would gain a lot by bringing in different knowledges, different cultures, and allowing them to achieve their potential under the roof of the university without sort of being siloed away. So in many ways, I think we have the skills and capacity there. We just need to work at allowing it to breathe in our institution.
Absolutely. I might bring you in, Margaret, because I know you've been a really vocal proponent of international collaboration, and with a global crisis like COVID-19 and also climate change, it strikes me that international collaboration and cooperation is more necessary than ever. But at the same time, there are political and social barriers that really appear to be increasing between nations. So what is our role as universities to facilitate the global sharing of knowledge and expertise, and how do we balance that against any possible risks?
Well, I think, you know, I'm obviously a big proponent of international collaboration, but I think it's, we've got to be, again, in sort of educating people who are concerned about the risks, and you know, have conversations where I've had conversations with certain officials who think the fact that we're in an international community as scientists and universities is kind of news to them, you know, and it's like, did you know that this might happen in such and such a country? Yes, well, you know, how many times have you visited that country? I've been there 10, 15 times, or like Duncan talking about Vietnam. So there's a sort of an aspect to international education and international science that we've undersold the benefits of in the Australian community anyway. So that's one thing. The second thing that international collaboration does is provides opportunities for people who may not be working in the paradigm that's funded or supported with a national framework. And, you know, if I think of an example of that from the COVID crisis from QUT, who was working here at QUT but collaborating internationally with the World Health Organization, but didn't fit into a neat funding paradigm for, say, the NHMRC, but was able to keep her work going partly through the international collaboration with WHO and China, and now has been very extraordinarily influential in the discussion around the airborne transmission of the virus. If we hadn't had those international links, it would have been hard for Lydia to maintain that research, and we wouldn't have lost that expertise. You know, somebody else would have snapped it up. So we need to not only continue to support it, but we need to make sure we've got that expertise, and that the scientists in that community of scientists are the best people to tap into that. And I really hope that short-term geopolitical considerations don't put barriers in the way of that.
Sorry, I muted myself while I had a little cough. I'm unmuted now. Looking at the time, I think we need to talk briefly about policy making and the role of universities in policy making. You know, is it a case of shouting from the sidelines, or is it talking directly to governments from behind closed doors, trying to persuade them what to do? What does it look like, given the knowledge and expertise that we have? Duncan, what's your take on the best way that our experts can inform policy?
Look, I think there's a number of different ways that can be done. And I think a lot of different people have different views on this. My own personal view is to try to make, even if you don't agree with somebody politically or ideologically, try and make yourself into a critical friend, okay? What never works is shouting from the sidelines, in my experience. Sometimes you have to come out strong and say something publicly that is negative, right? Sometimes that has to happen, but constant shouting from the sidelines really, in my experience, never works. So I think it's important to have constant dialogue with people, to be there at the end of the phone if they want to talk to you, to you know, give honest opinions and give them clearly. When you give an honest opinion about a scientific matter, be clear about what the evidence is for that as well, and treat people as adults. Actually, mostly they'll repay you. Sometimes they don't. But mostly they'll repay that approach in my experience and in my opinion. So I think that's where I would stand on that. It doesn't hurt also to, as a university, to rally around the university's supporters. So there are sometimes people that politicians, for example, would listen to very closely, and if you've got a contact like that, then talking to that person and getting that person to advocate for you or for your position is often very powerful too, in terms of convincing people, you know, of your viewpoint. Yeah, and I must say that I'm sure Margaret will support me in saying that there is a lot of that going on at the moment with our politicians from the university sector. Maybe a lot of people don't realise that or don't see it and don't understand, but my God, we're doing a lot of that at the moment. In trying to protect the sector and in trying to make sure that we survive this crisis and that we come out thriving and doing what we need to do actually for the country.
Yeah, I'd just add to that, and you know, we are doing a lot of sort of immediate, absolutely, you know, the amount of work that's going on behind the scenes, quietly influencing and so on. And the other thing is, I think we have to, it comes back to the communication question and Duncan's point about teams, is we have to value that in a way within the institution so that people feel that, you know, we have to value a good policy paper that gets taken up in, by government just as much as a publication in a journal with a high impact factor. And And we also have to value that bridge, you know, so it's the research informed policy, but then that may require some interpretation, and that's harder to do than just putting the paper out there. But if we don't, we vacate the space to the kind of consulting, and no disrespects to any consultants on the line, we vacate that because we haven't provided accessible information to inform the policy. And so we have to value not only the kind of media communication, but also the kind of policy work that can inform government as well.
And I'd have to agree. I think that we need relationships is the big thing. And I think that's what Duncan was also getting at is, you know, you need to cultivate relationships. And also, you know, this is how I view the university. I view us, we're public servants, you know, we offer a service to the public. We should be there to be drawn upon for our expertise. And no one really listens to someone coming in, arm waving and saying, you've got to do this, because I'm the expert of this, you know. I think if you really can sort of debase yourself with that myth that you know everything, and not something we all do, I'm sort of caricaturing someone here that probably doesn't exist, but you know, you come in and are quite humble and you come in and say, you know, these are my skills, this is my toolkit, not get offended if you don't get used, you might get used the next time. But that's what we're here for. You know, we're here, the university's charter, the enduring purpose is to benefit society through transformative impact of education and research. That's our purpose, you know, we need to serve that purpose, and we are public servants, you know, so I don't think we're not really discrediting ourselves in that role. I actually think it's an honour to perform that role in society.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I'd like to touch on racism. I think racism and its really distressing outcomes have been in the spotlight this year. And let's be honest, historically, universities haven't always been on the right side of that particular crisis. I'm interested in your thoughts on what the role of the university is in tackling racism from within, but more broadly. Duncan, would you like to take that one on?
Yeah, well, I've tried to make clear in everything I've always said in my life, and certainly since I've been here, that I find racism completely abhorrent. I've said several things about racism since I've been here, and every time I say anything, there's somebody who sends me a message that is says I've said the wrong thing. So forgive me if I'm trying to choose my words carefully, but
understood.
I'll lay it on the line. I find racism abhorrent. I don't understand where people are coming from when they are racist, and I will do everything in my power to kill it dead whenever I see it. I will set up policies in this place and prosecute them vigorously to ensure that we don't have racism in this university. And I think by and large we don't actually, overtly. Do we have covert racism? I don't know. Do we have institutional structures which are difficult for people of certain ethnic origins to negotiate? We probably do. And they're things that are deep-rooted that we have to think through very hard and that we have to get rid of, and that we have to make the place comfortable for everybody of any culture and any background to come to contribute to our community. I think that's so important. I think we have to be very careful in some cases, commenting publicly on events. So I was criticised, I'm going to be completely open here, I was criticised for not calling, we had an attack on 2 of our students in the city, and I was criticised for not calling it a racist attack. The reason I didn't do that was because it had not been before the courts yet. And I've had experience in the past of people, not me, but other people opening their mouth too early in that sort of situation and compromising the eventual legal proceedings. And the one thing, I don't care if people think that I'm doing the wrong thing, actually, it doesn't bother me in the slightest if I know that I'm doing the right thing. And the right thing here is to get the buggers into prison if necessary, if that's the right outcome. But also people have to have a fair trial. We have to believe in our justice system. And we have to make sure that that fair trial gets the right result. And if there was a racist attack, they go to jail or get heavily fined or whatever this censure is. Now, that's a pretty idealistic view. I know it doesn't sit well, actually, in the social media age where everyone comments instantly on everything. But that's where I'm coming from. So we have to do everything in our power to not just root out racism, but to make the place work in a way that doesn't even feel racist to people who come here. And it's not a instant. There's not a bunch of instant, easy solutions either to some of this stuff. We've got to work through all sorts of interesting and difficult ways of thinking and behaving. I mean, my thinking is evolving all the time about this as well. You know, I'm no paragon of virtue. I learn every day when people, things happen which I would never have thought was racist. And then somebody explains to me why it is. And I think, oh my God, yeah, so it was. and let's do something about that now. And that's what life's all about. You know, if you're an intelligent person, even if you're not an intelligent person, it's about learning all of the time and trying to do the right thing, I think. I
couldn't agree more. I'm looking at the clock and thinking of the many, many things I would still like to ask you all, but I'm going to attempt to slip in one last question that I would very much like to hear briefly from all of you. Now, I think universities like to think of themselves as incubators for future leaders, not just teaching knowledge, but also shaping people to be useful in the world. And the university education that you each received clearly laid a foundation for you to make useful contributions to the world. But I think given that the future our current students are facing looks quite different to the future that we were all preparing for as university students, what are universities doing right? What do we need to do differently? I know that's a big question and we don't have many minutes left, but you know, is there something that we need to do differently to equip our current students with what they're going to need for the future?
Well, I think we could, it gets back to my point before about talent mapping, or, you know, harvesting, or whatever you want to call it, going through the people in our institution and allowing those who see themselves to becoming future leaders, those that you feel might be a future leader, and provide them with the kind of training, whether that be a leader in the communication space, mentoring them up with you, Jen. Oh, there's probably going to be too much work for you, but you know what I mean.
No, bring it on. I'm ready.
But really, we could do a lot more, I think, and I think it's done in maybe at the school level, maybe even the faculty level. Alex could speak to that, maybe, or even the university level. It's just not as obvious to me that we have that overall strategy of, okay, let's build pipelines and pathways to direct the talent that we see or recognise and get the right training and equip those people to fulfil that potential. That's not forcing. And that's getting to Duncan's point. It's not everyone needs to become a leader. It's, you know, those who show the aptitude and the want, give them every opportunity to achieve that. And as Margaret says, recognise that in the way that we recognise other KPIs and stuff like that in our performance metric through our working lives, our student lives, working lives, and beyond. I think we could do a lot of really strategic stuff in that space.
Fantastic, Michael. Thank you. Margaret, your brief thoughts.
I really want to hear Michael's thoughts on racism.
I know, I'm sorry.
But one thing there, I think we need more data out there, because when you look at all the systemic data, whether it's Asian Australians, whether it's Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander Australians, the numbers are pretty stark. And so even if it's not obvious, the data's there to show the challenges we face. I think we're going to have different kind of awareness amongst our students to create the leaders of tomorrow, in you know, whether it's awareness of various cultural issues, or whether it's data, or whether, you know, there's a whole range of attributes that our students are going to need going forward that are different to what we've been teaching them, or experiences we've been generating for the last 10 years, and different to what our lived experience was at different times in university land. So, but it's going to be, you know, I think that's a very important conversation that warrants a bit more than a couple of minutes to think through what that might look like.
Thank you, Margaret. Finally to you, Duncan.
I would agree that one thing I want to say, I got a message the other day actually from one of my colleagues in university, and she was saying, she was being very nice, you know, thank you for your leadership and everything else. In these days where all we do is talk about leadership, I want you to know that there are quite a few of us out here who are happy being followers. And, you know, I think we mustn't forget that not everyone, as Michael said, not everyone has to be a leader, actually. What we should be doing is educating people in the deep sense. I do make there's a distinction between education and training, very, you know, different things in my opinion. They go together in certain areas, but they're different attributes. And, you know, I think, going back to something I've said before, and it's the old Plutarch quote, you know, it's minds aren't empty vessels to be filled with knowledge. They are fires waiting to be lit. And you know, that's the thing I think a really great university does best of all is, yeah, a smart kid's going to get the knowledge almost no matter what the lecturer does, actually. You know, but they need to understand that knowledge is fluid, that you need to interrogate knowledge, you need to challenge it, you need to have the tools to challenge it properly, and you need to work out, therefore, how research works around that challenge and around scholarship in different subjects. And then to understand in a deeper way the subject area you're interested in because of all of that challenge that you've been taught to do. And that it's not just creative thinking, it's not just critical thinking, it's a combination of all sorts of different ways of approaching and knowledge and thinking about knowledge. And it's different epistemological systems, as Michael said earlier. You know, it's understanding all that as well. So I think that's, for me, that's the cornerstone and the bedrock of what proper universities should be doing. And I don't think that's going to change no matter what post-COVID world looks like. In fact, it's probably going to be even more important to be doing that.
Indeed. Thank you to all of you for dealing with a big question in a short amount of time. I appreciate it. We are out of time, despite the fact that I feel like we could continue talking fruitfully for quite a lot longer. But my warmest thanks to each of you. It's been such an interesting discussion. Thank you for your time and your insightful thoughts. So to Professor Duncan Maskel, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, to Professor Margaret Sheil, the Vice-Chancellor of the Queensland University of Technology, and to Associate Professor Michael-Shawn Fletcher, the Assistant Dean Indigenous in the Faculty of Science in the University of Melbourne. Thank you to all of you. And it would be remiss of me not to end by reminding everyone that happily this is National Science Week, my favourite week of the year. And that means that it's also Science Festival here at the University of Melbourne. We're hosting around 30 events this week for our festival. So please, we're only on Wednesday. There's plenty more to come. Do check out our remaining events on our website. So you can Google Science Festival Melbourne and look at all the wonderful things that are still to come. So thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you to Alex for hosting. And please take good care, everybody, and good night.